Dave, you are regional editor of Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. Could you inform about this organization? What's your goal? What's your target? What's your aim?
Okay. It grew out of an organization that began in Sarajevo in early, maybe 10 years ago. A program for Croats, Serbians, and Bosnians to start doing reporting together in Sarajevo. Now it is a network of investigative reporters that stretches from Latvia all the way to Azerbaijan. We work on stories in individual countries, and we also work on stories together that cross borders between countries. My particular job is as regional editor for Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. So I work together with reporters in all three countries on stories about all three countries, and occasionally the stories across the borders of the three countries.
If I understand, you get articles from these regions and you publish on your website, and also you do training for journalists for these regions, yes?
It's a combination of that, but what we first do is publish not on our website, but in the countries themselves. For instance, this week we have a story in Liberale magazine about wine in Georgia and the supply this year. We did an investigation of that. So we try to put it in local language and in local media first, then we put it on our website, because to us it's more important that these stories are read in the countries here in the Caucasus. So we do that first, then we put it on our website, usually translated into English, so there's a little more access to it.
What do you think? How important journalists' role in struggling against crime and corruption in these countries?
Not this country, it's the entire world. Probably the most interesting work that's being done in journalism right now is this cross-border work against maybe trafficking of money, people. All this stuff is crossing borders, and what we've been told over and over again is that the criminals are many years ahead of both government and journalists in understanding in this modern computer age how you can move money, how it can help you move people, move equipment all around the world, and how it's impossible to keep up with them and track them. It's almost like a chase. The criminals are ahead, yeah. And both government and, in our role as journalists, we're trying to catch up, both on the technology and on the journalism.
Could you compare the situation with journalists with these three countries? Where is easy to work to be journalist?
I've been lucky enough to be in 40 countries, and I still have not found one where it's easy to be a journalist. Starting with Azerbaijan, these election years are tough. I think everybody can agree on that if we don't agree on anything else. It's a very poisonous situation between media, between government, between non-government organizations. It's a tough situation. Armenia just went through, their election earlier this year. It was not smooth journalism. It was not a smooth election. These are tough times. I call them pressure points, elections, because all the problems, all the difficulties in dealing day to day, between government, between journalists, between business, all parts of society. Elections tend to magnify, and bring all the problems to the front. And sometimes there's a lot of cooperation in countries that goes unnoticed, in day-to-day life. And too often that just disappears when you get to an election. Georgia is in a funny period this year, in my opinion. Having had the election last year and a kind of surprising outcome to most people. Even though there's a presidential election this year, I think it's generally agreed that it's not a very hotly contested race. It's not a race for a job that looks like it's going to be very important in the future, as it's written into the Constitution. That could change. What's interesting about this project and what has appealed to me, I first worked on it in 2006 in Sarajevo when it was just starting. And Drew Sullivan, who is the guy who started this and runs it for the most part, he was a nuclear scientist first, literally. So he came into journalism with the idea that you start with data, you start with facts, you start with numbers. You get as much information as you can from documents, and you start with that. And if you've got the numbers right and accurate, and you interpret them fairly, you've got the good basis for investigative journalism. That doesn't mean you don't have to find sources, all the difficult work, find people to talk, on the record, off the record, a million other things. But this whole program is based on, let's get the facts. You know, it's not just journalists. One of the stories we're working on in Georgia, we just started, is this whole idea of surveillance and the fact that not just government, but everybody has so much technology now, whether it's a camera you're pointing at me or the computer here. We all, in our own way, sort of have the capability to invade the privacy of other people, both personally and professionally, looking at their work. And I happen to be from America, and in our country, and in every country that I know of, the courts, the government, media, private citizens are trying to figure out what is this balance. You know, how much information is public, how much of our life is private, and how do we regulate it? At what point does the camera get shut off? At what point do you stay out of mail and phone, even if you think there's a security problem for your country? There's no right answer for this. And I think journalists, we have our own idea about it. We know governments have their own idea about it, and they're not the same idea in any country. But I don't think anyone has really come to a very good solution or found a very good middle ground. Government's always going to say we're doing this to protect, you know, security, economy. You may agree or disagree with that. They're always going to say that. Journalists are always going to say, you need to leave me alone. You need to let me do my work. I need privacy to do my work. There's a middle ground there somewhere, but nowhere in the world has anybody found it yet. And it's really the biggest issue in journalism today, if you ask me. We're about to find out. There's a trial going on right now. The WikiLeaks trial is going on in America, you know, as we're filming this. And at this point, only the leaker, the gentleman from the army who leaked stuff to WikiLeaks, is on trial. But in that trial, they have a term in English in America, an unindicted co-conspirator, and they have been throwing that term around with the journalists who accepted the leaks and did the work. Now, they have not put any journalists in prison. I think the last one I was just reading about this was maybe in 1968. It was the last time somebody was really convicted as a journalist along these lines. But it's closer now than it's ever been in the United States to that happening. So, again, I get back to the same thing. Nobody has figured out the legal balance here. You know, I have to be honest with you, that's in a question of economy. It's very easy for us in the West, you know, some of our media outlets. The point I'm trying to make is, it's easy for me to sit here because the newspaper I worked for in America for a long time is 180 years old. So it has established reclama, so it can have the financial independence to say no thank you, and and maybe not feel like they're obliged to government. But it took 180 years to get to that position. I've worked in countries far poorer than in the Caucasus, where, if government didn't give some support, there would be no media at all. Because there are some countries, small countries in this world, where there's no reclama, literally. So there would be no media. Is it a problem? Are you, like you said, beholden to the government? A little bit, yes. But there are economic realities in the world. In the case of Azerbaijan, that's a good question, because your media ownership, let's be frank here, nobody is surviving on reclama. You own media in Azerbaijan because you want to own media, because you want to have a voice, because you want to be heard, you want to be seen. So that's a decision each media outlet has. It probably slows the process down a little bit because, like anybody else, we get dependent on money, and if money's coming every year from a source we can depend on, maybe we're not as aggressive as we should be trying to find money in other means. I go back to the same thing, the system in all the Caucasus country is only 20 years old. And I think if you looked at a lot of countries all over the world, it took more than 20 years to develop a media system where the reclama was really supporting it. So yeah, it's of course it's not a perfect situation. It is a realistic one. A media that's not a business is not media. I think every government in the world is afraid of Facebook, and they should be, because it is impossible to control. It's impossible to block enough sites. It's impossible to find enough servers to stop. This is the first time, they can find some people, they can punish some people, they can intimidate some people, maybe scare part of the population, but they cannot control. Nobody has the technology, nor do they physically have enough people to monitor conversations. So, you can choose a word. I guess afraid probably is a good word. I mean, government by its nature means control, positive and negative sense. Facebook is one of the first technologies that's come along where governments everywhere do not feel like they're in control, and they panic, and this is normal.
What is your prediction for this next 3-4 months about social network in Azerbaijan? Because you see every time government strengthen its activity on control on social network. What's your prognosis?
That's a very good question. I think it gets down to how the government does it. Certainly if it's done in any way that makes people angry, and we've seen this in a lot of countries, once people get angry, they go online, and instead of posting twice a day, they post 20 times a day, or they start posting photos, or they start posting video, which is extremely effective. It's the same thing with the election in general. If the temperature in the country is somewhat calm, hopefully government won't feel like they have to, be as intimidating. Realistically, I think, as we sit here today in early June, emotional temperature in Azerbaijan is pretty high. In government, in civil society, in media, in business. And as that temperature goes up, Facebook doesn't shrink. Social media, we've seen no experience where it shrinks as a result of this type of situation. It grows. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, that's an observation. I'm going to answer that two ways. The first one is, particularly in Georgia, when I first came, 2003, 2004, there was a crop of journalists who went into the business almost like patriots, I call them. After the Rose Revolution, they thought, this is how I can help the country by improving the media, by writing stories about Georgia. And people went into the media for that reason. 8 years later, it's more like a business here, which is probably better. I mean, certainly the Rose Revolution is not as exciting now as it was to a youngster, a young journalist or a young student, as it was in 2004. So students now in Georgia, the Georgian students in English, they're more pragmatic. They're more, can I make a living doing this? Is this what I want to do? Can I get 2 or 3 jobs and make enough money, to have a family and stay in this line of work? It really is more like a business. I would say in Azerbaijan and in Armenia, because of the politics of government and everything else, it's a different situation in both countries. I think the motives for an Azeri journalist, speaking very generally, is still a little bit of patriotism and a little bit of, I want some change. I think in Armenia, in a different way, maybe it's sort of the same message. And this is not anti-government or anything else. It's just this feeling among young people that if I get into the business, I can make some changes in my country. It's a very interesting question. I'll tell you why. I would like to say even 10 or 15 years ago, being a military journalist was mostly to go to the site of a battle or go to an army base, talk to people, write a pretty straightforward story on what you see and hear, and only occasionally did you have to worry about giving away secrets. It might be a weapon at a base, or it might be the exact location of of troops. It was probably that way for maybe 150 years. That was sort of the basis of how to cover military. Then with the explosion of computers, the explosion of the technology of the weapons. This is all in the last, say, 10 years, 10, 12 years. The explosion in how we could conduct war across several borders. You know, we no longer march 1 million people across a border to meet another army of 1 million people. You know, we launch a missile from 5, 6 countries away, and we hit a target, you know, the size of this coffee cup, it seems. It's so much more difficult now, I think, to understand where the line is between what you can report and what really should be kept secret for country security. Governments, just like we were talking about earlier in this interview, are always going to be for control. And honestly, to be fair to a head of state, and Obama has said this, because Obama's been very tough on military leaks. And he has as much as said, I don't want to go to bed at night thinking that some soldier is going to die because I let military information get out. So that's how he goes to bed at night. He's a civilian. So you can understand the military wanting to be even more controlling now than they ever were. At the same time, I think it's fair, and I'll be careful by throwing this word in, but if you're, let's say, an opponent of an army, let's say you're a terrorist, how easy is it now to get online and get so much information about a country's military? You know, there's so much data out there. No matter how, whether it's you as a journalist writing or just the data that comes out, you know, that government puts out or a military puts out or a military school puts out. There's so much information out there already that, frankly, puts people in danger. It's got to be a balance. It's got to be a balance. If it's just a business, you're doing nothing for society. If, and this has happened too many times around the world, activists who go straight into journalism and there's no business background for it, it dies. You know, it's the best work for people, it's the best work for society, but it doesn't get distributed and nobody sees it. So, and that's universal all over the world, in any country, in any economic system. You've got to find that balance in the beginning.
Do you have any project for this region for next months, especially for Azerbaijan journalists?
I got about 20 in the 3 countries, and honestly, I'm not going to talk about them because they are investigations. It's not fair that the reporters aren't sitting here today who are getting information right now for them to not have the freedom to go out and ask their questions and everything else. Certainly do. Again, these take a long time. I never like to say it will be ready next month, because particularly in our system, the way we set up, when we do a story, every single fact in it has to have a footnote. It has to have a document, or an audio tape, or a videotape, or notes. So, and this is the way my boss does it. He says, you know, this is facts. So when we finish a story, we're nowhere near done. We have to go back and we have to put a footnote for every single fact in the story. Then I edit it, then my boss edits it, then he gives it to a group of fact checkers who know nothing about the story. And they go through and they check those footnotes. And they go back to me and they go back to the reporter. And only to the best of our ability when we're sure.
Yes, last question.
So it takes time.
Yes. Do you have addition for this interview, and do you want to say something to Azerbaijan journalists?
This is my 11th year on and off in the Caucasus, and I would never for a second question competence of the Azeri journalists or their courage. I think anybody would say it's probably been disappointing how the media has developed as a business there, and there's a lot of reasons for that. And there's still a long ways to go. Some of the things we mentioned earlier, where there's enough reclama, where there's a situation of true economic independence, where, say, a media outlet doesn't feel like it has to, you know, accept some government help or be involved. But again, it takes time. And to someone, you know, young journalist, 20 years seems like forever. But I know if you go back in the history of the United States, and I've done this in class, if you go back the first 20 years in the history of journalism in the United States, a lot of problems. So it does take time.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.